Case 1. Christie Michelle Scott, August 16, 2008, Franklin County. In the small town of Russellville, Alabama, nestled in the rolling hill country of Franklin County, life moved at the unhurried pace typical of so many close-knit southern communities. Neighbors knew neighbors. Church parking lots filled on Sunday mornings. And on a quiet residential street called Signore Drive, a young family appeared, at least on the surface, to be living an ordinary life. Christie Michelle Scott, 30 years old, was a wife and mother of 2 boys, Mason, 6 years old, and his younger brother, Noah, 4. But behind the closed doors of that home, something had already begun to unravel long before the early morning hours of August the 16th, 2008. Mason was a bright but vulnerable child. He had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, a condition that shaped how he communicated, how he processed the world, and how he interacted with the people closest to him. For many families, raising a child with additional needs becomes a defining, often deeply bonding experience. Investigators would later suggest that for Christie Scott, it became something else entirely, a source of frustration that, according to multiple witnesses who testified at trial, she did not always hide well. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, emergency dispatchers in Russellville received a call that would change the trajectory of an entire community's sense of safety. A house was on fire on Signore Drive. Christie Scott, along with her younger son Noah, had escaped the blaze and rushed to a neighbor's door for help. But Mason remained inside. Firefighters arrived within minutes, battling smoke and flame that had already taken hold of the residence. When the fire was finally extinguished and crews were able to search the wreckage, they discovered Mason's body in the bedroom he shared with his brother. The devastation was immediate and profound. A community mourning the loss of a 6-year-old boy, a family seemingly shattered by tragedy. But almost immediately, small inconsistencies began to surface. Investigators with the Alabama State Fire Marshal's office noted that this was not the first time a residence connected to Christie Scott had burned. In the years prior, her home had reportedly caught fire on more than one occasion, and members of her own family, including her father, later testified about a pattern of fires that had followed Christie throughout much of her adult life. None of the earlier incidents had ever been definitively proven as intentional, but taken together with what fire investigators found at the Signore Drive residence, a very different picture began to take shape. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence to emerge was financial. In the months leading up to Mason's death, records showed that Christie and her husband had taken out life insurance policies on both of their sons. And in a detail that would come to define the case in headlines across the state, it was revealed that Christie Scott had applied for and secured an additional insurance policy on Mason's life just 12 hours before the fire broke out. A policy valued at $100,000, layered on top of policies already in place. Combined, the family stood to receive well over $150,000 in the event of Mason's death. At trial, prosecutors built a case not only on the physical evidence collected at the scene, evidence that fire investigators say pointed clearly toward an intentionally set blaze rather than an electrical malfunction, as the defense would argue, but also on the testimony of more than 70 witnesses who painted a picture of a mother whose behavior, both before and after the fire, raised serious concern. A hairdresser testified that on the very day of Mason's passing, Christie sat through a 20-minute appointment without once mentioning her son. A relative recalled Christie, while holding her young niece at Mason's funeral, remarking that her daughter might finally get the baby sister she'd always wanted, a statement so jarring in its timing that it left the courtroom in stunned silence. Other witnesses described a woman who had, on more than one occasion prior to the fire, been seen speaking harshly to Mason in public, even shoving him on the very morning of the day he lost his life. The trial itself stretched across 4 grueling weeks in the summer of 2009, held before a jury in the Franklin County Circuit Court. The prosecution's theory was straightforward but devastating. That Christie Scott had drugged her son with cough syrup to ensure he would not wake, deliberately set the fire in the boy's bedroom, and allowed her own child to lose his life in pursuit of an insurance payout. The defense maintained her innocence throughout, arguing the fire had started from faulty electrical wiring and that Christie was a grieving mother, not a calculated offender. After deliberating for just over 2 days, The jury returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of capital murder. What followed next stunned even seasoned courtroom observers. The jury, by a vote of 7-5, had recommended that Christie Scott be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But under a legal provision that existed in Alabama at the time, a process known as judicial override, the presiding judge held the authority to disregard the jury's recommendation entirely. Circuit Judge Terry Dempsey did exactly that, declaring in his ruling that justice must be served, and the only way justice can be served in this case is by death. Christie Michelle Scott was transported to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she remains to this day, one of a small number of women on Alabama's death row. Her case has passed through the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, the Alabama Supreme Court, and even the United States Supreme Court, each of which declined to overturn her conviction or sentence. Notably, her case became one of the examples cited by Alabama lawmakers years later when they voted, in 2017, to abolish judicial override going forward, though that change in the law was not made retroactive, meaning it offered no relief for Christie Scott's existing sentence. What remains long after the headlines faded is a simple, aching truth. A 6-year-old boy who struggled to make himself understood in a world that didn't always accommodate him never got the chance to grow up. His story is a difficult one, but it's also an important one, a reminder of why communities, teachers, neighbors, and family members are so often the first line of defense for children who cannot advocate for themselves. If you ever notice signs of neglect or harm involving a child in your life, reaching out to local child protective services or a resource like the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline can make all the difference. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 2. Heather Level Keaton, November through December 2010, Mobile County. Some cases in this series unfold in a single, sudden moment of violence. Others reveal themselves slowly, painfully, over weeks and months, as investigators piece together a timeline that a family had gone to great lengths to conceal. The case of Heather Level Keaton belongs to the second category, a case that didn't begin with a body being found, but with 2 children simply disappearing from the lives of everyone who once knew them, and no one noticing quickly enough to intervene in time. Heather Level Keaton was in her early 20s, a visually impaired college student attending Spring Hill College in Mobile, when she entered into a relationship with a man named John DeBlaise. John was several years older, recently divorced, and the father of 2 young children, Neelley, who was 4 years old, and Chase, who was 3. Their biological mother had lost custody of the children after struggling to care for them, and John had been granted custody the year before. By all accounts from those who knew the family early on, John was seen as a devoted father. That perception would not survive what investigators eventually uncovered. As Heather's relationship with John deepened, she moved in with him and the 2 children, eventually leaving school behind entirely. What followed, according to prosecutors, was a period during which Neelley and Chase were subjected to isolation, evidence of prolonged neglect, and conditions that deteriorated far outside the view of relatives, teachers, or neighbors who might otherwise have raised concern. The family moved frequently, staying for stretches at extended-stay motels, cutting off much of the outside contact the children might once have had. By the spring of 2010, according to testimony later presented in court, Neelley's health had begun to visibly decline. Witnesses recalled the children looking pale, thin, and unwell during this period. A manager at one of the motels where the family stayed testified that both children always looked sickly. A friend of John's who encountered the family at a retail store around this time said Chase appeared severely unwell, yet neither John nor Heather seemed alarmed. Neelley did not survive that spring. Chase followed months later, in June. For months afterward, the true nature of what had happened to Neelley and Chase remained hidden. Family members were told the children had been sent to stay with relatives out of state. It wasn't until later that year, after mounting questions from relatives who hadn't seen or spoken to the children in months, that investigators in Mobile began piecing together a deeply troubling picture. In December of 2010, following an intensive search, investigators located Neelley's partial remains in a wooded area near Citronelle, Alabama. 2 days later, Chase's remains were discovered in a heavily forested area across the state line in Mississippi. The condition of the remains left investigators with limited physical evidence. Of Neelley, only a small number of bones and teeth remained. Of Chase, even less. What followed was one of the most emotionally difficult prosecutions Mobile County had seen in years. John DeBlaise was tried first and convicted of both children's deaths in 2014, receiving a death sentence of his own. Heather Keaton's trial followed in the summer of 2015. Prosecutors presented evidence suggesting the children had suffered prolonged mistreatment in the months before their passing, including testimony from a medical examiner who indicated that toxic substances may have contributed to how the children came to lose their lives, alongside evidence of injuries inconsistent with any accidental explanation. The defense argued that responsibility rested primarily with John DeBlaise, and that Heather herself had been controlled and manipulated within the relationship. The jury did not fully accept that framing. On August 20th, 2015, Heather Keaton was convicted of capital murder in connection with Chase's death and reckless manslaughter in connection with Neelley's. She became the first woman in Mobile County history to be sentenced to Alabama's death row. Her case did not end there. In 2020, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Keaton had not been given a proper opportunity to address the court before her original sentencing, and her case was returned to Mobile County for a new sentencing hearing. In January of 2021, she was sentenced to death a second time. Her attorneys have continued to pursue appeals since, including a petition to the United States Supreme Court, which declined to intervene in 2023. Today, Heather Keaton remains on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, while John DeBlaise remains on death row at a separate facility for men. What makes this case so difficult to sit with is not just the outcome, but how long it took for anyone outside the household to notice something was wrong. How two small children could seemingly vanish from the world around them for months without anyone raising the alarm in time. It's a sobering reminder of why community awareness matters so deeply. If a child in your life seems to disappear from school, from routine checkups, from the people who once saw them regularly, it's worth asking questions. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available around the clock for anyone who suspects a child may be in danger, and reporting a concern that turns out to be nothing is always better than staying silent about something that turns out to be everything. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 3, Lisa Graham, July 5, 2007, Russell County. Not every case in this series involves a stranger crossing paths with a victim in a moment of chaos. Some of the most unsettling stories are the ones where the person responsible for a loss of life is someone who was supposed to protect that person above all others. That is the story of Lisa Graham, a woman from Phoenix City, Alabama, whose relationship with her own daughter deteriorated into something that would ultimately end that daughter's life. And it is one of the most chilling contract-based cases Russell County has ever prosecuted. To understand what happened on that July night in 2007, it helps to understand the family dynamic that had been building for years beforehand. Lisa Graham and her husband, Kevin, ran a construction business in the Phoenix City area, and their daughter, Stephanie, known to nearly everyone as Shay, was 20 years old at the time of the events that would end her life. By her own family's account, and by testimony later given in court, Shay's late teenage years had been turbulent. She had become involved in drug use, according to trial testimony, and had recently been arrested in connection with a drive-by shooting incident in nearby Columbus, Georgia. Rather than allowing the legal process to run its course, Lisa and Kevin Graham had posted a $100,000 bond to get their daughter out of custody and had hired an attorney to represent her. For most parents, this kind of intervention would be described as an act of desperate love, a family trying to save a child from the consequences of a downward spiral. But testimony from multiple witnesses at trial painted an entirely different picture of how Lisa Graham actually felt about the financial and emotional burden her daughter had placed on the family. Neighbors, family friends, and even a man who lived nearby and had known the Grahams for years all took the stand to describe conversations they'd had with Lisa in the weeks and months leading up to Shay's death. Conversations in which Lisa did not hide her anger. One neighbor testified that Lisa told him directly she was tired of the little witch, using a much harsher word in the original testimony, and that she offered him $5,000 if he would end her daughter's life. He said he initially thought she was joking, until she repeated the request, and made clear she meant it. He declined. Another woman who lived nearby testified that Lisa spoke about her daughter's death so frequently and so casually that it began to feel less like venting and more like planning. She recalled overhearing a conversation between Lisa and a man named Kenneth Walton, a longtime family friend who had done carpentry and construction work for the Grahams for years, in which the two discussed, in chillingly practical terms, how such an act could be carried out, how quickly it could be done, and how the aftermath could be concealed. Kenneth Walton had his own troubled history, a criminal record that included prior drug-related offenses, but he had remained close to the Graham family for years, trusted enough to be given work, and, evidently, trusted enough to be brought into the darkest plan imaginable. On the evening of July the 5th, 2007, prosecutors say Lisa Graham met Walton at a public library in Columbus, Georgia, and handed him a 9mm pistol. Later that night, Walton approached Shay under the pretense that he was going to help her find a car to buy, a plausible cover story given his long-standing relationship with her family. Shay left with him willingly, having no reason to suspect the man she'd known for years intended her any harm. Walton drove Shay across the Georgia-Alabama line and into rural Russell County, eventually stopping along a remote stretch of road near Bowdoin Road, not far from the small community of Pittsview. According to the account he later gave police as part of a plea agreement, he told Shay they were stopping so she could relieve herself along the roadside. It was there, in the darkness, that Walton shot Shay multiple times before leaving her body along the dirt road. A passing driver discovered her the following morning and called emergency services immediately, but there was nothing to be done. The medical examiner who later testified in court described a scene of extreme violence. Multiple gunshot wounds to the head and torso, injuries that shocked even experienced investigators who had handled violent cases for years. Because witnesses had seen Shay leave a gas station with Kenneth Walton the night before, investigators focused on him almost immediately. Confronted with mounting evidence, Walton eventually admitted his involvement and, critically, implicated Lisa Graham as the person who had orchestrated the entire plan and supplied the weapon. Detectives searched for the firearm and eventually learned that Lisa had given it to an elderly neighbor to clean, a detail that, once uncovered, effectively sealed her fate in the eyes of investigators. What followed was an extraordinarily long road to justice. Walton ultimately pleaded guilty to his role in exchange for a sentence of life in prison, avoiding the possibility of a death sentence himself in return for his cooperation. Lisa Graham's case, however, dragged on for years. A courthouse renovation project delayed proceedings. Her first trial, held years after the crime itself, ended in a mistrial when the presiding judge was forced to step down due to declining health. It would take until March of 2015, nearly 8 years after Shay's death, for Lisa Graham to finally stand before a jury in the Russell County Circuit Court. The evidence presented was extensive and emotionally devastating. Prosecutors played a recorded conversation between Lisa and her husband, captured after they had both been brought in for police questioning, in which Lisa could be heard making statements that revealed far more than she likely intended. The jury found her guilty of capital murder, and by a vote of 10-2, recommended that she be sentenced to death. The trial court accepted that recommendation, citing the fact that Shay's death had been committed for financial motive and through a calculated contract arrangement, an aggravating factor under Alabama law. Lisa Graham's appeals have continued in the years since, including a challenge before the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, which upheld her conviction and sentence in 2019. She remains today at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, having exhausted much of the appellate process available to her. The case remains, to this day, one of the most talked about in Russell County's history, not simply because of the brutality of what happened to Shay Graham, but because of the deeply unsettling nature of a mother turning against the very child she was meant to protect. Family conflict, addiction, and unresolved resentment can create dangerous conditions inside a household long before anyone on the outside notices. If you're aware of a family situation that feels as though it's escalating toward real danger, reaching out to local authorities or a resource such as the National Domestic Violence Hotline can sometimes be the intervention that changes the outcome before it's too late. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 4, Patricia Blackmon, May 29, 1999, Houston County. In 1990, In the city of Dothan, Alabama, a 28-year-old woman named Patricia Blackmon made the decision to adopt a young girl named Dominiqua Bryant. For nearly a decade, from the outside looking in, the arrangement appeared to be a success story, the kind of adoption narrative that reassures a community about the resilience of a child placed with a new family. A caseworker from the Houston County Department of Human Resources visited the home on a monthly basis during part of that period, checking in on Dominiqua's well-being, and reported no concerns. A neighbor who frequently left her own children in Patricia's care for hours at a time later testified that she had never seen anything to suggest reason for alarm. By every outward measure, Patricia Blackmon was viewed as a devoted mother. That perception collapsed entirely on the night of May the 29th, 1999. At around 9:30 that evening, a call came into emergency dispatch from Patricia's mobile home. She told the operator that her daughter was not breathing. When paramedics arrived at the residence, what they found was almost too much to comprehend. Dominiqua, 28 months old, not yet even 2.5 years of age, was lying on the floor of the master bedroom. She was wearing only a diaper and a pair of socks soaked through with blood. Her small body was covered in vomit. There was a significant swelling on her forehead, and blood was visible on her chest. Paramedics attempted to revive her at the scene before rushing her to Flowers Hospital, where an emergency room physician continued efforts to save her life. Despite those efforts, Dominiqua was pronounced deceased less than an hour after first responders arrived. What the subsequent medical examination revealed would shock even veteran investigators who had spent careers working child fatality cases. Dominiqua's body showed evidence of extensive recent injury layered on top of what appeared to be older, healed injuries from prior incidents. A pattern that spoke not to a single moment of loss of control, but to a much longer period during which this child had endured repeated harm largely hidden from the outside world. The chief medical examiner for the state of Alabama, Dr. James Downs, testified that among Dominiqua's injuries was a distinct impression left on her chest, one that, upon careful comparison, matched the sole pattern of the sandals Patricia Blackmon had been wearing that day. Investigators also recovered a broken pool cue from inside the home, and forensic testing confirmed the presence of Dominiqua's blood not only on the cue itself, but across multiple items throughout the residence: a child's shirt, a bedsheet, a quilt, several napkins. Dr. Downs further testified that some of Dominiqua's injuries were consistent with having been inflicted using that same pool cue. At trial, held in Houston County, the prosecution's case rested on the argument that Dominiqua's final hours occurred while she was alone with Patricia Blackmon, and that the extent and pattern of her injuries were simply incompatible with any accidental explanation. The defense attempted to characterize the death as the tragic result of a failed effort to revive an unconscious child, suggesting some of the trauma may have occurred during attempts at resuscitation rather than through deliberate harm, an argument the jury ultimately did not accept. Patricia Blackmon did not testify in her own defense, exercising her constitutional right to remain silent throughout the proceedings. The jury convicted her of capital murder under Alabama law, which classifies the death of a child under the age of 14 as a capital offense. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors argued that the circumstances surrounding Dominiqua's final hours were especially heinous and cruel, a legal threshold that, if met, allows for the state's most severe sentence. The defense presented several mitigating factors on Patricia's behalf: testimony describing her as a devoted daughter-in-law, evidence that she had been granted legal custody of Dominiqua through the juvenile court system, and character testimony from those who said she had been a positive presence even while awaiting trial in the Houston County Jail. Ultimately, none of it was enough to sway the outcome. The jury recommended, by a vote of 10-2, that Patricia Blackmon be sentenced to death, and the circuit court followed that recommendation. Patricia Blackmon appealed her conviction in the years that followed, arguing in part that if Dominiqua had been rendered unconscious early in the encounter, then the remainder of what happened to her could not legally be classified as especially cruel, since she may not have been aware of the pain that followed. In August of 2005, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals unanimously rejected that argument and upheld both her conviction and her death sentence. Patricia Blackmon has now spent longer on Alabama's death row than any of the other women currently held at Julia Tutwiler Prison, having arrived there in the summer of 2002. Her case remains a haunting example of how a child who appeared, from the outside, to be thriving in a stable adoptive home, was in reality enduring a private nightmare that no caseworker, no neighbor, and no family member fully recognized until it was far too late. Cases like this one underscore why regular, attentive oversight of children in foster and adoptive placements matters so deeply, and why any adult who notices unexplained injuries, behavioral changes, or signs of fear in a child should feel empowered to speak up. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline exists precisely for these situations, for the moments when something feels wrong, even if you can't yet prove it, and a call might be the only thing standing between a child and a tragedy that could otherwise go unnoticed until it's too late. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 5, Tierra Capri Gobble, December 15, 2004, Houston County. By the time Tierra Capri Gobble was 21 years old, she had already lived a chaotic and deeply troubled existence, one shaped by instability long before she ever became a mother herself. Born in 1983, she had, by her early 20s, already lost custody of 2 of her children to child welfare authorities in the state of Florida. Her first child, a daughter named Jewel, had been removed from her care in December of 2003 after the Florida Department of Children and Families intervened due to concerns about neglect and abuse. Jewel was placed in the custody of a paternal relative. Less than a year later, in August of 2004, Tierra gave birth to a son in Plant City, Florida, a boy she and the child's father named Phoenix Parrish. Within 24 hours of his birth, Florida authorities once again intervened, removing Phoenix from Tierra's custody due to the agency's prior history with the family. Phoenix was placed in the care of his father's family, specifically with a paternal great-uncle named Edgar Parrish, along with a man named Walter Jordan. The arrangement came with strict conditions handed down by child welfare authorities. Phoenix's caregivers were not to allow contact between the infant and his biological parents, and they were not permitted to relocate the child out of the state of Florida without appropriate oversight. Tragically, both of those conditions would be violated within months. In October of 2004, the family relocated to Dothan, Alabama, and once there, Tierra Gobble and her boyfriend, Samuel David Hunter, were allowed to move into the same household as Phoenix, restoring exactly the kind of unsupervised access that the original custody order had been designed to prevent. At the same time this relocation was taking place, legal proceedings had already begun to formally terminate Tierra's parental rights. In October of that year, she had signed an affidavit indicating her intent to give up those rights voluntarily, and by early December, the termination proceedings were actively underway. It was during this narrow window, a family in legal limbo, a child under supervision that had quietly evaporated once they crossed state lines, that Phoenix Parrish's life came to its tragic end. On the morning of December the 15th, 2004, Phoenix was rushed to the emergency room at Southeast Alabama Medical Center in Dothan. He was 4 months old. When he arrived, he was not breathing and had no detectable pulse. The emergency room physician who treated him that day, Dr. Jonas Salm, would later testify that Phoenix's small body bore bruising and contusions across his face, scalp, and chest. Injuries so extensive that, in the doctor's own words, they were everywhere. X-rays revealed a fractured skull, fractures to both of his wrists, and a fracture to his upper arm. Despite the medical team's best efforts, Phoenix could not be revived, and he was pronounced deceased shortly after arriving at the hospital. According to Tierra's own account, given to investigators from the Houston County Sheriff's Department, she had been Phoenix's primary caregiver during the 10 hours immediately preceding his hospitalization, even though legal guardianship technically rested with Walter Jordan. She told detectives that she sometimes became frustrated with Phoenix when he wouldn't settle down to sleep, and she offered several explanations for his injuries, suggesting she may have gripped him too tightly while holding him, causing his rib fractures, and describing an incident in which she leaned quickly into his crib to retrieve a blanket, possibly causing his head to strike the crib's side. She did not call emergency services when she first realized something was wrong, telling investigators she was afraid of the trouble it would cause her. The most damning piece of evidence introduced at trial, however, was not physical at all. It was a letter written by Tierra herself, produced during her cross-examination. In it, she had written, in her own words, that it was her fault her son had not survived, though she insisted she never intended for it to happen. Prosecutors also called a witness, a woman named Tori Jordan who had known Tierra for roughly 2.5 years and had occasionally cared for her older daughter, Jewel. Tori testified that Tierra had once told her, in a moment of raw and unsettling honesty, that if she couldn't have her children, then no one would. The trial, held in Houston County, resulted in Tierra Gobble's conviction on the charge of capital murder, a classification available under Alabama law specifically because Phoenix was under the age of 14 at the time of his passing. During the sentencing phase, the defense introduced evidence describing Tierra's own difficult and abusive childhood, hoping to persuade the jury toward leniency. It was not enough. The jury recommended, by a vote of 10-2, that she be sentenced to death, and the presiding judge, Lawson Little, accepted that recommendation on December 1, 2005, stating plainly from the bench that what had happened to Phoenix was simply not acceptable in his community. Tierra Capri Gobble appealed her conviction and sentence to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, which upheld both in April of 2010. She remains today at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, one of the 5 women currently held on Alabama's death row. Notably, Phoenix's father, Samuel David Hunter, pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of manslaughter in connection with the case and served a separate, considerably shorter sentence, while the great-uncle who had taken Phoenix in, Edgar Parrish, pleaded guilty to child abuse charges related to violating the custody restrictions that had been placed on the family. What stands out most starkly about this case is how many separate systems, a child welfare agency in one state, a custody arrangement meant to protect an infant, a network of family members who were supposed to serve as a safeguard, all failed to prevent contact between Phoenix and the parent from whom he had been deliberately, legally separated. It is a devastating illustration of how quickly protective boundaries can collapse once a family crosses state lines, and how critical it is for caregivers, relatives, and communities to honor custody arrangements exactly as courts intend them, even when family pressure makes it difficult to do so. If you are ever aware of a custody or protective order being violated involving a child, contacting local authorities or the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline can help ensure that protective measures already put in place by a court are not quietly undone. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 6. Lynda Cheryle Lyon Block, October 4, 1993, Lee County. Not every case that leads to Alabama's death row involves a child victim or a domestic betrayal. Some are born out of a much broader, more chaotic descent, a spiral of extremist ideology, fugitive life, and a fatal encounter with law enforcement that unfolded in broad daylight in a busy parking lot. That is the story of Lynda Cheryle Lyon Block, whose case remains, to this day, uniquely significant in Alabama's history. She is the only woman the state has executed since the death penalty was reinstated nationally in 1976. Lynda Block's path to that Walmart parking lot in Opelika, Alabama, did not begin with a single sudden act. It began years earlier, rooted in a personal ideology that increasingly rejected the authority of state and federal government. By the early 1990s, Lynda had become involved with a man named George Sibley, and the two had grown deeply entrenched in a belief system associated with the sovereign citizen movement, a loosely organized set of beliefs that reject the legitimacy of most government institutions, including local law enforcement, courts, and licensing requirements. Custody disputes involving Lynda's children from a previous relationship had already placed her in direct conflict with family court authorities in Florida, and by the time she and Sibley fled that state, they were considered fugitives. On the morning of October 4, 1993, Lynda Block and George Sibley found themselves in the parking lot of a Walmart in Opelika, a college town in Lee County, home to Auburn University. According to accounts later presented in court, their infant son had wandered away from their vehicle, prompting a passerby to alert a nearby police officer. That officer was Sergeant Roger Motley of the Opelika Police Department, a respected and well-known figure in the local law enforcement community. Sergeant Motley approached the couple's vehicle to check on the situation and, in doing so, walked directly into what would become one of the most violent and consequential encounters Lee County had ever witnessed. As Sergeant Motley approached, a confrontation erupted. Both Lynda Block and George Sibley were armed, and in the chaos that followed, Sergeant Motley was shot in what witnesses in the parking lot described as a terrifying and rapid burst of violence. He did not survive his injuries. The attack occurred in full view of numerous bystanders in a public shopping center parking lot on an otherwise ordinary weekday morning. A level of exposure and brazenness that shocked the entire Lee County community and drew statewide attention almost immediately. In the aftermath, Block and Sibley fled the scene, sparking a manhunt that stretched across state lines before the two were ultimately apprehended. Both were charged with capital murder in connection with Sergeant Motley's death, a charge elevated to capital status under Alabama law specifically because the victim was a law enforcement officer acting in the line of duty. Lynda Block was tried separately from Sibley, and during her trial, she represented much of her own defense, using the proceedings as a platform to expound at length on the sovereign citizen ideology that she and Sibley shared, arguing that the laws under which she was being prosecuted did not legitimately apply to her. The jury did not accept this defense. She was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. George Sibley was tried separately and received the same sentence. Lynda Block's case moved through Alabama's appellate courts over the following years, with her legal arguments largely continuing to center on the legitimacy of the court's authority over her rather than on traditional legal defenses. Her appeals were ultimately unsuccessful. On May 10, 2002, Lynda Cheryle Lyon Block was executed by the state of Alabama using the electric chair, becoming, in that moment, the only woman executed in Alabama since the state resumed capital punishment following the nationwide reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. George Sibley remains on death row to this day, still pursuing appeals decades after the events in that parking lot. The Motley family, along with the Opelika Police Department and the broader Lee County community, has continued to honor Sergeant Motley's memory in the years since, and his death remains a solemn reminder of the very real risks law enforcement officers face during even the most routine calls. Checking on a family in a parking lot, addressing what appeared to be nothing more than a wandering toddler. It's a sobering illustration of how quickly an ordinary moment can turn into tragedy, and why community support for the officers who serve on the front lines every day remains so vital. Organizations like the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund exist to honor officers like Sergeant Motley and to support the families they leave behind. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 7. Amy Bishop, February 12, 2010, Madison County. By the time Amy Bishop walked into a faculty meeting at the University of Alabama in Huntsville on the afternoon of February 12, 2010, she had already built a life that, on paper, looked like a genuine academic success story. Amy held a doctorate from Harvard University, had trained as a research fellow at Harvard Medical School, and had, after several years of navigating the competitive world of academic biology, secured a position as an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. She was married, a mother of 4 children, and outwardly presented as an accomplished scientist working to establish herself in a demanding academic environment. But beneath that surface, colleagues and administrators would later describe a woman who had grown increasingly volatile, isolated, and consumed by a sense that the institution around her was working against her professional future. The central issue, according to those familiar with the situation, revolved around Amy's pursuit of tenure, the permanent academic position that many university faculty spend years working toward, and without which a professor's career at a given institution can effectively come to an end. In the months leading up to February of 2010, Amy had been informed that her application for tenure had been denied. For many academics, a tenure denial is a devastating professional setback, but one that typically leads to a search for a position elsewhere. For Amy Bishop, colleagues later said, the decision appeared to trigger something far more serious. On the afternoon in question, the biology department's faculty were gathered for what was, by every account, a routine weekly meeting, the kind of administrative gathering that takes place at universities across the country without incident, week after week, year after year. Amy Bishop was present among her colleagues. Partway through the meeting, according to survivors who later gave testimony and statements to investigators, Amy stood up, produced a handgun, and without warning began firing at the people seated around her. The scene that unfolded in the following moments was chaotic and terrifying. 3 of Amy's colleagues, faculty members she had worked alongside for months, did not survive the encounter. 3 others were struck and wounded but survived, including one staff member who was shot but managed, remarkably, to escape the room and alert others in the building, helping to bring the attack to an end and ensure that emergency responders were called immediately. Huntsville police arrived at the scene within minutes and took Amy Bishop into custody without further incident, still on the university campus. The investigation that followed quickly expanded well beyond the events of that single afternoon. As Amy Bishop's background came under renewed scrutiny, investigators and journalists uncovered a deeply troubling detail from more than 2 decades earlier. In 1986, when Amy was in her early 20s and living in Massachusetts, her younger brother had been shot inside their family home during an incident that authorities at the time determined to be accidental, and no charges were filed against her. In the wake of the Huntsville shooting, that earlier case was reopened and re-examined by authorities in Massachusetts, ultimately leading to renewed charges being filed against Amy in connection with her brother's death decades earlier, though that separate legal matter unfolded on its own track, distinct from the Alabama prosecution. Here in Alabama, prosecutors in Madison County moved forward with capital murder charges against Amy Bishop in connection with the 3 colleagues who had lost their lives during the faculty meeting. The case drew intense national media attention, in part because of the unusual setting, a university science department, a tenure dispute, a highly educated defendant with an Ivy League background, and in part because of the sheer number of victims involved in a single, sudden act of violence inside an academic building that had, until that afternoon, been considered an entirely safe and unremarkable place to work. Rather than proceeding through a lengthy trial, Amy Bishop ultimately entered a guilty plea in September of 2010, avoiding a jury trial and, with it, the possibility of a death sentence. In exchange for her plea, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court determined that the circumstances of the case, along with the plea arrangement reached with prosecutors, warranted this sentence rather than capital punishment, and Amy Bishop was transferred to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she remains incarcerated to this day. The University of Alabama in Huntsville, along with the broader Huntsville community, spent years grappling with the aftermath of that February afternoon, implementing new campus safety protocols, supporting the families of those who had lost loved ones, and working to help faculty and students process the fact that a routine departmental meeting had become the site of unimaginable violence. The case remains one of the most widely studied instances of workplace violence within American higher education, frequently cited in discussions about mental health support for faculty under professional pressure, and about the importance of universities taking early warning signs seriously long before a crisis point is reached. If you or someone you know is a professional experiencing overwhelming stress, isolation, or a sense of crisis tied to workplace pressures, reaching out to a resource like the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline can provide meaningful support before a situation escalates beyond the point of return. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 8. Judith and Neelley, September 25, 1982, DeKalb County. Of all the cases examined in this documentary, few carry the particular weight of the story of Judith and Neelley, a case that began when its central figure was barely more than a child herself, and one that continues to generate fierce public debate more than 4 decades after the events that defined it. In 1982, Judith and Neelley was just 18 years old. She had married a man named Alvin Neelley several years earlier, when she was only 15 and he was in his mid-20s, a relationship that, according to later accounts, placed Judith almost entirely under Alvin's control from an extraordinarily young age. By the time Judith reached her late teens, the couple had already begun engaging in a pattern of increasingly serious crimes together, moving through Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. What happened on September the 25th, 1982, however, would come to define the case in ways that no earlier incident had. That evening, at the Riverbend Mall in Rome, Georgia, a 13-year-old girl named Lisa and Milliken was spending time with a group from the Ethel Harpst home, a residential facility that cared for neglected and abused children in the area. At some point during the outing, Lisa became separated from her group. According to the account later established at trial, Judith and Alvin Neelley approached the young teenager near the mall's arcade and, through manipulation, coerced her into leaving with them. What followed over the next several days remains among the most disturbing sequences of events described in this entire series. Lisa was taken to a motel in Scottsboro, Alabama, where she was held against her will. Investigators and prosecutors described a period of sustained, severe mistreatment during her captivity, treatment that Alabama courts would later describe using the strongest language available under the law to characterize the depth of harm inflicted upon her. On September the 28th, 3 days after she was first taken from the mall, the Neelleys drove Lisa to a remote and strikingly beautiful natural landmark in DeKalb County, Alabama, the rim of the Little River Canyon, near the town of Fort Payne. There, according to evidence presented at trial, Judith Neelley used a needle and syringe to inject Lisa with a caustic household chemical in a horrifying attempt to end her life through poisoning. When those injections failed to achieve that outcome, Judith shot Lisa in the back and her body was left at the base of the canyon. In a chilling detail that investigators would later use to help build their case, Judith herself telephoned law enforcement in the days that followed, first contacting police in Rome, Georgia, and later the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office, providing details about where Lisa's body could be found, information that had not yet been made public and that only someone directly involved could have known. Detectives, working methodically over the following 2 weeks, eventually traced the couple to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where Judith was taken into custody on October the 9th on unrelated charges, with Alvin apprehended shortly afterward. As the investigation expanded, authorities also connected the Neelleys to additional crimes committed in the same period, including the abduction of an engaged couple in Rome, Georgia, a case in which the young woman involved also lost her life, while her fiancé survived and was ultimately able to identify the Neelleys to investigators, providing crucial testimony that helped bring the couple's crime spree to an end. Judith Neelley's trial began in March of 1983 in Fort Payne, held before a DeKalb County jury over the course of 16 days. Her defense centered on the argument that she had been coerced and controlled by her husband, a man more than a decade her senior who had married her when she was still a minor and who, her attorneys argued, had directed much of what occurred during Lisa Milliken's captivity. The jury heard this defense, but ultimately convicted Judith of capital murder in connection with Lisa's death. During the sentencing phase, the jury recommended that she receive a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, but the trial judge, exercising the same judicial override authority that would later factor into other cases in this series, rejected that recommendation and sentenced Judith Neelley to death. At 18 years old, she became the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States at that time. Alvin Neelley, meanwhile, avoided trial for Lisa Milliken's death by pleading guilty to related charges in Georgia and was never formally tried for his role in what happened at Little River Canyon. He received a life sentence and remained incarcerated in Georgia until his passing in 2005. Judith Neelley's case took an extraordinary turn in January of 1999. Just days before her scheduled execution, then Governor Fob James commuted her death sentence to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15 years, a decision that ignited significant controversy across Alabama and drew sharp criticism from members of law enforcement and from Lisa Milliken's surviving family members, who felt the commutation represented a profound injustice given the severity of what had occurred. In the years since, Judith Neelley has come before the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles on multiple occasions, most recently in May of 2023, when her request for release was denied unanimously in less than 3 minutes, with board members citing the extraordinary severity of the crimes she had been convicted of. She remains ineligible to apply for parole again until the year 2028, and successive Alabama governors, including current Governor Kay Ivey, have gone on record specifically requesting that she never be granted release. Lisa and Milliken's surviving family members have spent decades advocating on her behalf, including successfully campaigning for legislation known as Lisa's Law, which prevents convicted offenders in Alabama from profiting financially from the retelling of their crimes. Their efforts stand as one of the more remarkable examples in this series of a victim's family transforming grief into lasting legal reform. This case, more than perhaps any other in this documentary, raises difficult questions about age, coercion, and culpability within abusive relationships, questions that courts, lawmakers, and advocacy groups continue to wrestle with today. If you or someone you know is in a relationship marked by control, manipulation, or fear, the National Domestic Violence Hotline offers confidential support to help navigate those circumstances safely. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 9. Betty Woods Wilson, May 22, 1992, Madison County. In the affluent neighborhoods of Huntsville, Alabama, where physicians, engineers, and business owners built comfortable lives around the city's booming aerospace and medical industries, few families seemed as outwardly successful as the Wilsons. Dr. Jack Wilson was a respected ophthalmologist, well known throughout Huntsville's medical community. His wife, Betty Woods Wilson, had once worked as a nurse specializing in kidney dialysis before leaving her career behind to embrace the comfortable lifestyle that came with being married to a successful eye surgeon. By 1992, they had been married for 14 years, living in a large brick home on Boulder Circle, complete with the trappings of upper-middle-class success. The cars, the furs, the jewelry that friends would later recall when describing Betty's transformation from working nurse to society wife. But behind the comfortable exterior of that marriage, cracks had been forming for years. Dr. Wilson had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease relatively early in their relationship, a condition that eventually required surgery resulting in a permanent colostomy. Friends and family later described how this medical reality placed considerable strain on the intimate side of the Wilsons' marriage, a strain that Betty reportedly struggled to come to terms with. Over the years, according to people close to the family, Betty had also developed a dependence on alcohol, later became involved in Alcoholics Anonymous, and, according to rumors that circulated among friends, began pursuing relationships outside her marriage, including with men she met through her recovery community. Whatever combination of resentment, dissatisfaction, and desire for a different life had built up inside that Huntsville home, it converged catastrophically on the night of May the 22nd, 1992. That evening, Betty Wilson placed a frantic call to emergency services, telling the dispatcher she had returned home to find her husband on the floor, seriously injured. When Huntsville police arrived at the home, they discovered Dr. Jack Wilson's body in the house, and it quickly became apparent that this was no accident and no random act of opportunistic violence. Dr. Wilson had suffered extensive injuries from a severe physical attack, including trauma from a heavy object and additional wounds to his chest. A bloody baseball bat was recovered near his body. Nothing of significant value appeared to have been taken from the home, and there were no obvious signs that anyone had needed to force their way inside. Details that, taken together, quickly steered investigators away from the theory of a random robbery gone wrong and toward a far more personal and calculated explanation. The investigation that followed uncovered a story almost too dramatic to believe. Betty had a twin sister, Peggy Lowe, who lived several hours away in the small town of Vincent, Alabama, where she worked as a first-grade teacher and was married to a Baptist deacon. Despite their very different public reputations, Betty, the glamorous doctor's wife, Peggy, the devoted schoolteacher and church choir leader, the two sisters remained extraordinarily close throughout their adult lives. It was through Peggy that investigators eventually found their way to a man named James White, a handyman in his 40s who had done carpentry work at the elementary school where Peggy taught. According to the account White later gave investigators as part of a plea arrangement, he and Peggy had developed a close personal relationship over time, one that led him to feel a deep, almost obsessive loyalty toward her, a loyalty, prosecutors argued, that Peggy and Betty ultimately exploited. White told detectives that Peggy had confided in him that her sister was unhappy in her marriage and that her sister's husband mistreated her, a claim that friends of the Wilsons would later dispute entirely, describing Dr. Wilson as a devoted and gentle husband. According to White's statements, an arrangement was proposed in which he would be compensated financially in exchange for ending Dr. Wilson's life, allowing Betty to remain married to her husband's considerable estate rather than facing him in a divorce that could have left her with far less. Investigators recovered evidence tying White directly to the scene, including Betty's own revolver discovered near his residence, along with a personal library book belonging to Betty that was found inside his truck, a detail investigators believe was used to pass along payment for the arrangement. Both Betty Wilson and Peggy Lowe were arrested and charged in connection with Dr. Wilson's death. The case exploded into a media sensation across Alabama and beyond, drawing coverage from national outlets fascinated by the story of twin sisters, both facing the same devastating charge, both maintaining their innocence, both presenting themselves with the kind of polish and composure that made the courthouse proceedings feel almost like a soap opera unfolding in real time. So many spectators attempted to attend the trials that the courthouse was forced to issue admission tickets simply to manage the crowds. James White ultimately reached a plea agreement with prosecutors, accepting a reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against both sisters. But the outcome of the two trials that followed diverged dramatically. At Betty Wilson's trial, prosecutors focused heavily on the terms of Dr. Wilson's will, which left the vast majority of an estate valued at more than $6 million to Betty. Combined with testimony from White and forensic evidence tying Betty directly to the crime, the jury found her guilty of capital murder for hire. Because Betty had waived her right to a jury for the sentencing phase, and prosecutors themselves recommended a sentence of life without parole rather than pursuing the death penalty, the court accepted that recommendation, and Betty Wilson was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Peggy Lowe's trial, held separately, resulted in an outcome that stunned many who had followed the case closely. She was acquitted of all charges, with many observers at the time suggesting that her carefully cultivated reputation as a devoted teacher and preacher's wife had swayed the jury in ways that the evidence alone might not have justified. Peggy has continued to live in Alabama in the years since, while Betty Wilson has remained incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, consistently maintaining her innocence and pursuing multiple unsuccessful appeals through the Alabama Supreme Court. She later remarried while still in prison, and independent filmmakers have continued to revisit her case in the years since, examining whether justice was fully and fairly served for both sisters given how differently their trials concluded. This case remains a compelling illustration of how financial motive, personal reputation, and family loyalty can intertwine in ways that make uncovering the full truth extraordinarily difficult for investigators and juries alike. It also stands as a reminder that domestic violence and marital strain can escalate in directions far beyond what outsiders ever suspect. If you're navigating a difficult or deteriorating marriage and fear for your safety or a loved one's safety, the National Domestic Violence Hotline provides confidential guidance and support at any hour of the day. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Case 10. Ashley Jones, August 30th, 1999, Jefferson County. The final case in this documentary is, in many ways, the most complicated, a story that forces viewers to hold two difficult truths at once. The almost unimaginable violence inflicted upon an entire family in the span of a single night, and the deeply troubled childhood of the 14-year-old girl who helped carry it out. It is a case that continues to generate passionate disagreement among legal scholars, child advocates, and members of the public alike, more than 2 decades after it occurred. Ashley Jones grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in circumstances that, by nearly every account later presented in court, were marked by severe instability from her earliest years. She had reportedly experienced abuse and neglect throughout much of her childhood, including from family members who were supposed to protect her. By the time she was 13, Ashley had already been involved in a violent incident within her own household, and she and her younger sister, Mary Elizabeth, were subsequently sent to live with their grandparents, Deroy and Mary Knowles, along with their aunt, Millie Knowles, who also resided in the home. For a time, this arrangement appeared to offer the girls a more stable environment than they had previously known. That stability began to erode as Ashley, then 14, entered into a relationship with a 16-year-old boy named Jeremy Hart. According to court testimony and later accounts, Ashley's grandparents strongly disapproved of the relationship, viewing Hart as a negative influence and attempting to limit contact between the two teenagers. Rather than accepting this boundary, prosecutors say Ashley and Jeremy began planning, over a period of time, to remove the obstacles that stood between them, a plan that would ultimately be carried out against the very family members who had taken Ashley and her sister in. On the night of August the 30th, 1999, with her grandparents, aunt, and younger sister all asleep in the home, Ashley let Jeremy Hart inside, arming him with her grandfather's own firearm, which she had retrieved earlier. What followed was an eruption of violence that investigators would later describe as among the most disturbing they had encountered involving a defendant of Ashley's age. Deroy Knowles, 76 years old, was found in the home's den, having sustained severe injuries during the initial confrontation. Millie Knowles, 30 years old, was found in her bedroom, having also sustained severe injuries. Mary Knowles, Ashley's 75-year-old grandmother, was injured as well but survived, as did Ashley's 10-year-old sister, Mary Elizabeth, who also sustained injuries during the incident but survived to testify about what had happened that night. In the aftermath, investigators determined that a fire had also been set inside portions of the home. Evidence, prosecutors argued, of an attempt to destroy proof of what had taken place. Firefighters responding to the scene were able to extinguish the flames before the home was completely destroyed. Money and a vehicle belonging to Ashley's grandparents were also taken from the home in the aftermath, and Ashley reportedly spent part of that same night away from the scene before she and Hart were both taken into custody as investigators quickly pieced together what had occurred. The case moved to trial in Jefferson County, where prosecutors presented an extensive and harrowing account of that night's events, supported by physical evidence and by the testimony of Ashley's surviving grandmother and sister. The defense, for its part, sought to introduce extensive evidence about Ashley's own history, describing a childhood marked by profound instability and mistreatment, and arguing that her age and background should weigh heavily in how the justice system ultimately treated her. The court, operating under Alabama's sentencing laws in effect at the time, was constrained in the discretion it could exercise given the nature of the charges. Ashley Jones was convicted on 2 counts of capital murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, and she received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a sentence handed down despite her being only 14 years old at the time of the events in question. For years, the presiding judge's own sentencing remarks were cited repeatedly in discussions about the case, noting that Ashley had not, in the court's assessment, expressed what the judge considered genuine remorse during proceedings, and referencing reports that she had made threatening statements to other inmates while awaiting sentencing. At the same time, Ashley's case became a frequently cited example in the national legal debate over whether juveniles, even those convicted of the most serious offenses, should ever be subject to sentences of life without the possibility of parole, given ongoing research into adolescent brain development and decision-making. That broader legal debate eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which issued a series of landmark rulings in the years following Ashley's conviction, determining that mandatory sentences of life without parole for juvenile offenders violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment, given that children, even those who commit the most serious crimes, possess a capacity for change that adult offenders may not. These rulings required states, including Alabama, to revisit sentences that had been handed down to individuals who were minors at the time of their offenses. As a direct result, Ashley Jones was re-sentenced in 2017, after having already served roughly 17 years in custody at that point, receiving a new sentence of life with the possibility of parole rather than her original sentence of life, without any such possibility. In a detail that adds yet another layer of complexity to this case, both Ashley's surviving grandmother and her younger sister, the 2 family members who survived that night and who bore direct, lasting injuries from what occurred, have publicly stated in the years since that they have forgiven Ashley and have advocated for her eventual release, a remarkable and, for many observers, deeply difficult position to reconcile with the severity of what took place inside that Birmingham home. Ashley Jones's case remains a profound illustration of how childhood trauma, inadequate intervention, and a justice system built primarily around adult offenders can intersect in ways that continue to challenge how society defines punishment, rehabilitation, and forgiveness. It also underscores how critical early intervention truly is for children experiencing abuse or instability at home. If you're aware of a child enduring a difficult or unsafe home environment, reaching out to the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline or local child protective services can help ensure that child receives support long before a situation reaches a breaking point. Don't forget to like and subscribe. That concludes our look at 10 of Alabama's most infamous cases involving women who found themselves on the wrong side of the state's justice system. From house fires and poisonings to contract killings and courtroom sentences that divided entire communities. 10 different women. 10 different paths that led them to the same place. Behind the walls of Julia Tutwiler Prison, or, in one case, to the ultimate consequence the state of Alabama can impose. What ties these cases together isn't just geography or gender. It's the pattern beneath them. Moments where a warning sign went unnoticed, where a system meant to protect someone fell short, where a single intervention at the right time might have changed everything. That's why we tell these stories here at Cold Case Hour, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to make sure the people at the center of it are never forgotten, and to remind all of us how much community awareness truly matters. If today's documentary moved you, informed you, or left you with something to think about, that's exactly why we do this. So take 2 seconds right now and make sure you're subscribed, because we bring you a new deep dive case every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and let us know which of these 10 cases affected you the most. We read every single one. And if you haven't already, hit that like button before you go. It helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. Thank you for spending this time with us. This has been Cold Case Hour. We'll see you in the next one.